There are moments in history when the scale of human suffering defies comprehension, when optimism collides with brutal reality, and the very ground becomes a testament to sacrifice. This is the story of such a moment, the grand offensive designed to break the deadlock of the Western Front. A battle where the hopes of a generation marched into a hail of bullets. Today, we confront the raw, agonizing truth of a battle that became synonymous with the futility of war. This is the Battle of the Somme. In the summer of 1916, the Great War had already consumed nearly 2 years. The Western Front stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea, a continuous scar of trenches, barbed wire, and mud cutting across the heart of Europe. Millions of men faced each other across no man's land, locked in a stalemate that seemed to have no end. And then, on July 1, 1916, on a quiet sector of the front line in northern France near the River Somme, the British Army launched the largest offensive in its history. What followed would become the most infamous battle of the First World War, a byword for futility, for senseless slaughter, for the horrific cost of industrial warfare. But the Battle of the Somme did not begin as a British idea, nor was it conceived as the massive, grinding campaign of attrition it would become. It began instead as a supporting operation, an attempt to help France survive its own nightmare at Verdun. Since February 1916, the German army had been hammering at Verdun with relentless fury, attempting to bleed the French army white through systematic attrition. By May and June, the French situation was becoming desperate. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, enormous material losses. The entire French army being fed through the meat grinder of Verdun, division after division, with no end in sight. The French desperately needed relief. They needed the Germans to divert troops and resources away from Verdun. And the way to force that diversion was to launch a major offensive elsewhere on the Western Front, an attack so large, so threatening, that Germany would have no choice but to shift forces to meet it. The location chosen was the Somme, a river in Picardy, in northern France, where British and French forces held adjacent sectors of the line. The plan, originally conceived in late 1915, called for a combined British-French offensive with roughly equal contributions from both armies. Together, they would smash through the German defenses and achieve the breakthrough that had eluded every previous attack. But Verdun changed everything. By the spring of 1916, France could no longer commit the forces originally promised for the Somme offensive. The French contribution was reduced from 40 divisions to just 16. The burden of the attack shifted overwhelmingly to the British, who would commit 18 divisions to the initial assault, the largest army Britain had ever put into the field. And this army was unlike any Britain had fielded before. At the outbreak of war in 1914, Britain had possessed only a small professional army, the British Expeditionary Force, brilliantly trained but tiny compared to the mass conscript armies of France and Germany. That original BEF had been largely destroyed in the battles of 1914 and 1915. The army that would attack on the Somme was something new. Kitchener's New Armies, named after Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War who had called for volunteers in 1914. These were citizen soldiers, men who had answered the call to serve, who had enlisted together from the same towns, the same factories, the same neighborhoods. They were the PALS battalions, units where friends, brothers, workmates fought side by side. They were brave, enthusiastic, patriotic, but they were also inexperienced. Most had been in uniform for less than 2 years. They had received basic training but had never experienced the reality of modern combat on the Western Front. They trusted their officers, believed in their cause, and marched toward the front line in the summer of 1916 with a confidence that would soon be shattered beyond recognition. Commanding this enormous force was General Sir Douglas Haig, recently appointed as commander of the British Expeditionary Force. Haig was a career cavalry officer. a man who had risen through the ranks in an era when wars were still won by maneuver and decisive action. He believed in the offensive. He believed that the breakthrough was possible if sufficient force was applied. And he believed that once the breakthrough was achieved, his cavalry divisions would pour through the gap and restore mobile warfare to the Western Front. It was a vision of war that belonged to an earlier century, but Haig believed it with absolute conviction. The plan for the Somme offensive was straightforward in concept. A massive preliminary artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses, cutting the barbed wire, collapsing the trenches, destroying the machine gun positions, and killing or demoralizing the defenders. Then the infantry would advance across no man's land, occupy the shattered German positions, and push on to the second and third lines of defense. Finally, once the breakthrough was achieved, the cavalry would exploit the gap and turn the German flanks. To accomplish this, the British assembled an unprecedented concentration of artillery. Over 1,500 guns were brought into position along the 18-mile front of the British attack. The bombardment would last 7 days, an entire week of continuous shelling. In that time, British artillery would fire over 1.5 million shells at German positions. It was, by far, the largest artillery bombardment ever attempted. British planners were confident it would accomplish its objectives. How could any defense survive such a storm of steel? But the plan contained fatal flaws that would become apparent only when it was too late to change them. First, much of the ammunition was defective. Up to 30% of British shells failed to explode, either because they were poorly manufactured or because their fuses were faulty. Shells that should have cut barbed wire or destroyed dugouts simply buried themselves in the ground without detonating. Second, the bombardment was spread too thin. Over 1.5 million shells sounds overwhelming, but when distributed across 18 miles of front and fired over 7 days, the density of fire at any given point was insufficient to completely destroy well-built German defenses. And third, most critically, British intelligence had completely underestimated the strength of German defensive positions. The Germans had spent nearly 2 years fortifying this sector of the front. They had dug dugouts 30 feet deep, reinforced with timber and concrete, proof against anything but a direct hit from the heaviest shells. These dugouts could shelter entire companies of soldiers, who would wait underground during bombardments and then emerge when the shelling stopped to man their positions before the British infantry arrived. The French, attacking on a shorter front with more guns concentrated in a smaller area, had better results. They also used different tactics, more flexible formations, better coordination between artillery and infantry, shorter bombardments that maintained surprise. On July 1st, French troops would achieve their objectives with relatively light casualties, advancing up to 2 miles in places. But the French were not the main attack. The main effort was British. And for the British soldiers waiting in their trenches as the week-long bombardment thundered overhead, the confidence was high. The artillery would do its job. The wire would be cut. The Germans would be dead or demoralized. The advance would be a formality, a matter of walking across no man's land and occupying the ruins of enemy trenches. That was what the soldiers were told. That was what the officers believed. That was what General Haig expected. They were wrong. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, as the summer sun rose over the Somme Valley, the British artillery bombardment reached its crescendo. For 7 days, the guns had fired almost continuously. Now, in the final hours before the infantry attack, they unleashed their maximum fury. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the earth and could be heard in southern England, across the Channel. In the British trenches, soldiers made final preparations. They were loaded down with equipment, 60 pounds or more per man. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, rations, water bottles, first aid kits. Some carried pigeons for communication. Others carried wire cutters, though they had been assured the artillery had already cut the German wire. The plan was simple. At 7:30 a.m., the artillery bombardment would lift, shifting its fire from the German front line to targets further back. At that same moment, the infantry would go over the top, climbing out of their trenches and advancing across no man's land toward the German positions. They would advance in waves, line after line of soldiers walking forward at a steady pace. Not running, walking. The officers believed this was necessary to maintain formation and control, to ensure that the men arrived at the German trenches as organized units rather than disordered mobs. The decision to advance at walking pace would prove catastrophic. At 7:20 a.m., British engineers detonated a series of massive mines that had been tunneled under German positions. The explosions threw earth hundreds of feet into the air, creating enormous craters and obliterating entire sections of German trench. The sound could be heard as far away as London. At 7:28 a.m., whistles were distributed to junior officers and NCOs along the British line. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blew, and over 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. In the German trenches and dugouts, soldiers had endured 7 days of bombardment. They had huddled in their deep shelters, sometimes for hours at a time, while British shells crashed overhead. Many dugouts had been damaged. Communication trenches had been collapsed. Some positions had been completely destroyed. But the deep dugouts, those 30-foot deep shelters that British intelligence had dismissed, remained largely intact. When the British bombardment suddenly lifted at 7:30 a.m., German soldiers knew exactly what it meant. The infantry assault was coming. Hundreds of men poured up the stairs from the dugouts, dragging their machine guns with them, setting them up in firing positions, loading belts of ammunition. And then they saw the British, long lines of soldiers advancing across no man's land, walking steadily forward, still hundreds of yards away. The German machine gunners opened fire. The MG-08 machine gun could fire 450 rounds per minute. A single gun, properly positioned with overlapping fields of fire with other guns, could sweep an entire sector of no man's land. And the Germans had not just one gun or 10 guns, but hundreds, positioned in fortified emplacements, protected by concrete and steel shields, manned by soldiers who had survived the bombardment and were now fighting for their lives. The British soldiers, advancing in neat lines, presented perfect targets. The machine gun fire cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Men fell in rows. Officers leading from the front were hit first. Then the front ranks of soldiers. Then the ranks behind them. Some men made it to the German wire and found it uncut. The artillery bombardment that was supposed to destroy it had failed. The wire was tangled, thick, nearly impenetrable. Soldiers became caught in it, struggling to find gaps, cut their way through, or simply climb over. And all the while, the German machine guns continued firing. The PALS battalions, units where friends and neighbors served together, were destroyed as units. The Accrington PALS suffered 584 casualties out of 720 men in the first hour. The Sheffield City Battalion was virtually annihilated. The Newfoundland Regiment, attacking at Beaumont Hamel, lost over 700 men out of 800 in less than 30 minutes, the worst casualty rate of any unit on July 1st. Entire neighborhoods in British towns would receive telegrams on the same day, street after street, household after household, informing families that their sons, husbands, fathers had been killed. The grief was not individual but collective, whole communities mourning together, whole generations of young men erased in a single morning. In some sectors, British troops managed to reach the German front line and even push beyond it. Near Mametz and Montauban, in the southern part of the British attack zone, units achieved their initial objectives, capturing German trenches and consolidating their gains. These were sectors where the German defenses were weaker, where British artillery had been more effective, where fortune favored the attackers. But these were exceptions. Along most of the 18-mile front, the attack failed completely. Wave after wave of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and were cut down. Officers, seeing their men falling, ordered fresh waves forward, believing that determination and numbers would eventually overwhelm the defenders. But determination could not stop machine gun bullets, and the numbers simply meant more casualties. By mid-morning, no man's land was covered with dead and wounded. Men lay in shell craters, behind any scrap of cover they could find, pinned down by German fire, unable to advance and unable to retreat. The wounded cried out for help. Medics who ventured into no man's land to reach them were shot down. Some wounded men would lie there for days, dying slowly of their injuries or from exposure. In the British trenches, commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Communication with the forward units had been lost almost immediately. Runners were shot, telephone lines were cut, visual signals were obscured by smoke. Some commanders, receiving no reports of failure, assumed the attack was succeeding and ordered reserve units forward. These reserves walked into the same machine gun fire that had destroyed the first waves. By the end of the day, when the casualty reports began to reach British headquarters, the scale of the disaster became clear. July 1, 1916, 57,470 British casualties. Nearly 20,000 dead. Another 35,000 wounded. Over 2,000 missing, their bodies never recovered. It was the worst single day in the history of the British Army. More casualties than Britain had suffered in the Crimean War, the Boer War, and the Napoleonic Wars combined. An entire generation of volunteers, men who had answered Kitchener's call, who had believed in the cause, who had trusted their commanders, dead or maimed in a single day. What had gone wrong? How had the plan failed so completely? The artillery bombardment had not accomplished its mission. The wire was not cut. The dugouts were not destroyed. German soldiers had survived in their deep shelters and emerged to man their weapons when the bombardment lifted. The infantry tactics were suicidal. Walking across open ground in daylight against prepared positions and uncut wire was not bravery, it was murder. The soldiers had done everything asked of them. They had advanced with discipline and courage. But courage could not overcome the fundamental flaws in the plan. And the Germans? They had suffered relatively light casualties. Perhaps 8,000 on July 1st. Serious losses, but nothing like the catastrophe that had befallen the British. German commanders watched the British attack with a mixture of horror and disbelief. It seemed incomprehensible that any army would send its men forward in such a manner. Some German soldiers later reported feeling pity for the British soldiers they were killing. At British headquarters, General Haig received the casualty reports with shock. But he did not order a halt to the offensive. He could not. The strategic goal, to relieve pressure on Verdun, remained. The French were counting on continued British attacks to tie down German forces. And perhaps, with adjustments to tactics and better preparation, subsequent attacks might succeed where the first had failed. So the battle would continue. Not for days or weeks, but for 4.5 months. The Somme offensive, which had begun as a single massive attack, would become a grinding campaign of attrition, attack after attack, each achieving small gains at enormous cost, each adding to the casualty lists, each feeding more men into the insatiable machine of industrial warfare. July 1st had been a disaster beyond imagination. But it was only the beginning. The worst day of the Battle of the Somme was followed by 140 more days of fighting, each with its own casualties, its own small tragedies, its own contribution to the overall catastrophe. The Battle of the Somme had begun, and it would grind on, day after day, until winter itself forced it to stop. The PALS battalions, units where friends and neighbors served together, were destroyed as units. The Accrington PALS suffered 584 casualties out of 720 men in the first hour. The Sheffield City Battalion was virtually annihilated. The Newfoundland Regiment, attacking at Beaumont Hamel, lost over 700 men out of 800 in less than 30 minutes, the worst casualty rate of any unit on July 1st. Entire neighborhoods in British towns would receive telegrams on the same day, street after street, household after household, informing families that their sons, husbands, fathers had been killed. The grief was not individual but collective, whole communities mourning together, whole generations of young men erased in a single morning. In some sectors, British troops managed to reach the German front line and even push beyond it. Near Mametz and Montauban, in the southern part of the British attack zone, units achieved their initial objectives, capturing German trenches and consolidating their gains. These were sectors where the German defenses were weaker, where British artillery had been more effective, where fortune favored the attackers. But these were exceptions. Along most of the 18-mile front, the attack failed completely. Wave after wave of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and were cut down. Officers, seeing their men falling, ordered fresh waves forward, believing that determination and numbers would eventually overwhelm the defenders. But determination could not stop machine gun bullets, and the numbers simply meant more casualties. By mid-morning, no man's land was covered with dead and wounded. Men lay in shell craters, behind any scrap of cover they could find, pinned down by German fire, unable to advance and unable to retreat. The wounded cried out for help. Medics who ventured into no man's land to reach them were shot down. Some wounded men would lie there for days, dying slowly of their injuries or from exposure. In the British trenches, commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Communication with the forward units had been lost almost immediately. Runners were shot, telephone lines were cut, visual signals were obscured by smoke. Some commanders, receiving no reports of failure, assumed the attack was succeeding and ordered reserve units forward. These reserves walked into the same machine gun fire that had destroyed the first waves. By the end of the day, when the casualty reports began to reach British headquarters, the scale of the disaster became clear. July 1, 1916, 57,470 British casualties. Nearly 20,000 dead. Another 35,000 wounded. Over 2,000 missing, their bodies never recovered. It was the worst single day in the history of the British Army. More casualties than Britain had suffered in the Crimean War, the Boer War, and the Napoleonic Wars combined. An entire generation of volunteers, men who had answered Kitchener's call, who had believed in the cause, who had trusted their commanders, dead or maimed in a single day. What had gone wrong? How had the plan failed so completely? The artillery bombardment had not accomplished its mission. The wire was not cut. The dugouts were not destroyed. German soldiers had survived in their deep shelters and emerged to man their weapons when the bombardment lifted. The infantry tactics were suicidal. Walking across open ground in daylight, against prepared positions and uncut wire, was not bravery, it was murder. The soldiers had done everything asked of them. They had advanced with discipline and courage. But courage could not overcome the fundamental flaws in the plan. And the Germans? They had suffered relatively light casualties. Perhaps 8,000 on July 1st. Serious losses, but nothing like the catastrophe that had befallen the British. German commanders watched the British attack with a mixture of horror and disbelief. It seemed incomprehensible that any army would send its men forward in such a manner. Some German soldiers later reported feeling pity for the British soldiers they were killing. At British headquarters, General Haig received the casualty reports with shock. But he did not order a halt to the offensive. He could not. The strategic goal, to relieve pressure on Verdun, remained. The French were counting on continued British attacks to tie down German forces. And perhaps, with adjustments to tactics and better preparation, subsequent attacks might succeed where the first had failed. So the battle would continue. Not for days or weeks, but for 4.5 months. The Somme offensive, which had begun as a single massive attack, would become a grinding campaign of attrition, attack after attack, each achieving small gains at enormous cost, each adding to the casualty lists, each feeding more men into the insatiable machine of industrial warfare. July 1st had been a disaster beyond imagination. But it was only the beginning. The worst day of the Battle of the Somme was followed by 140 more days of fighting, each with its own casualties, its own small tragedies, its own contribution to the overall catastrophe. The Battle of the Somme had begun, and it would grind on, day after day, until winter itself forced it to stop. In the days and weeks following July 1st, the Battle of the Somme settled into a grim pattern. Attack, consolidate, prepare, attack again. Each operation targeted a specific objective, a village, a section of trench, a strategic ridge. Each was preceded by an artillery bombardment. Each resulted in casualties that, while smaller than the catastrophe of the first day, still numbered in the thousands. The names of these engagements, Mametz Wood, Pozieres Ridge, Delville Wood, Guillemont, became synonymous with prolonged, brutal fighting for objectives that seemed insignificant on a map but cost thousands of lives to capture. Mametz Wood was a dense forest on the Somme battlefield, roughly a mile square, that the Germans had turned into a fortified position. In early July, British and Welsh divisions were ordered to clear it. What should have been a straightforward operation became a week-long nightmare of close-quarters combat among the shattered trees. The woods offered concealment, but also confusion. Units lost their bearings. Companies became separated. Soldiers found themselves fighting isolated actions against enemy positions they could barely see. German machine gun nests, hidden among the undergrowth and fallen timber, cut down attackers at close range. The clearing of Mametz would cost over 4,000 British casualties for a single square mile of forest. Pozieres Ridge was a low rise that offered observation over the surrounding battlefield. Its capture was assigned to Australian divisions newly arrived on the Western Front. The Australians attacked repeatedly throughout late July and early August, capturing the village of Pozieres and the ridge beyond it in a series of vicious engagements. But the Germans understood the strategic importance of the position and subjected it to continuous, concentrated artillery fire. Holding Pozieres became as costly as capturing it. Australian casualties in the Pozieres operations exceeded 23,000 men, losses that would scar the Australian national consciousness and create a legacy of bitterness toward British command. The pattern was the same everywhere. Small gains, enormous casualties, and then the Germans would counterattack, trying to reclaim what they had lost, suffering their own heavy casualties in the process. The battle had become exactly what Falkenhayn had intended at Verdun, a grinding war of attrition where both sides bled themselves white for marginal territorial gains. But there was one crucial difference. At Verdun, Falkenhayn had been trying to draw French reserves into a killing ground of his choosing. At the Somme, the Allies were doing the same to the Germans, forcing them to commit reserves to hold positions, weakening their armies through sustained attrition, preventing them from concentrating forces elsewhere. In this sense, the Somme was achieving its strategic objective. German divisions were being pulled from Verdun and sent to the Somme. The pressure on the French at Verdun began to ease. But the cost to the British was staggering, and there seemed to be no end in sight. But amid the grinding attrition, military innovation was occurring. New tactics were being tested. New weapons were being introduced. And on September 15, 1916, the world witnessed the debut of a weapon that would eventually revolutionize warfare, though its first appearance was far from revolutionary. The tank. The tank had been developed in secrecy by the British over the previous year. It was designed to solve the fundamental problem of trench warfare: how to cross no man's land, overcome barbed wire and machine gun fire, and break through enemy defenses. The tank combined armor protection, firepower, and, most importantly, the ability to cross trenches and crush barbed wire, creating paths for infantry to follow. The early tanks were primitive machines. The Mark I tank weighed 28 tons, moved at a maximum speed of 4 miles per hour, and required a crew of 8 men to operate it. Inside, conditions were nightmarish, deafeningly loud, suffocatingly hot, filled with engine fumes. The crew suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning and heat exhaustion. Communication between crew members was nearly impossible over the noise. But despite these limitations, the tank offered something unprecedented: the ability to advance across open ground under machine gun fire and survive. Bullets bounced off its armor. Barbed wire was crushed beneath its tracks, and its own guns could suppress enemy positions as it advanced. On September 15th, 49 tanks were committed to an attack on the village of Flers-Courcelette. It was meant to be a dramatic demonstration of Britain's new secret weapon, a blow that would crack open the German defenses and finally achieve the breakthrough that had eluded every previous attack. The reality was less impressive. Of the 49 tanks that started the attack, only 32 made it to the starting line. The rest broke down during the approach march. Of those 32, 9 broke down almost immediately. 5 got stuck in shell craters or ditches. 9 were hit by German artillery or disabled by mechanical failure. That left 9 tanks that actually reached their objectives and supported the infantry attack. But those 9 tanks had an impact far beyond their numbers. Where they appeared, German defenders panicked. They had no weapons that could reliably stop these mechanical monsters. Troops fled or surrendered. Strongpoints that had held for months fell in minutes. The village of Flers was captured with the assistance of several tanks, and British soldiers reportedly sent back a message that became famous: "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind." The psychological impact of the tank was enormous, even if its tactical contribution was limited. For the first time since the deadlock had set in, there was a weapon that could break through defenses, that could protect advancing infantry, that offered hope of restoring mobility to the battlefield. But the technology was too primitive, too unreliable, and deployed in insufficient numbers to achieve a breakthrough at the Somme. The battle would continue as before, grinding attrition, attack and counterattack, small gains for terrible losses. As the weeks passed, tactics on both sides began to evolve. The rigid lines of July first gave way to more flexible formations. British commanders learned to concentrate artillery fire more effectively, to use creeping barrages where shells fell just ahead of advancing infantry, suppressing enemy positions until the last moment. Infantry attacks became more decentralized, with smaller units attacking specific objectives rather than whole divisions advancing on broad fronts. The Germans, too, adapted. They refined their defensive doctrine, establishing defense in depth with multiple lines of trenches, so that even if the front line fell, subsequent defensive positions could halt the attack. They brought in fresh divisions and more artillery. They built concrete pillboxes, small fortified positions that could withstand all but direct hits from the heaviest shells. By October, as autumn rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud, both sides were exhausted. The British had made gains, villages captured, ridges taken, several miles of ground won. But nowhere had they achieved the breakthrough that Haig had promised. The German defensive lines, though pushed back, remained intact. The war of attrition ground on, consuming men and material with no decisive result. And still Haig ordered more attacks. Limited operations, he called them. Bite and hold. Taking small objectives, consolidating, then attacking again. Each operation cost thousands of casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The soldiers who fought these battles understood the futility. They attacked because they were ordered to attack. They died in shell craters and trenches whose names they often never learned. And the survivors wondered when, if ever, it would end. By November 1916, winter was closing in on the Somme. The autumn rains had transformed the battlefield into an ocean of mud. Trenches collapsed. Shell craters filled with water. Men and horses drowned in the liquid filth. Tanks became hopelessly bogged down. Artillery pieces sank into the ground until they were impossible to move. The weather, more than any strategic decision, was forcing the battle toward its conclusion. The final major operations of the Battle of the Somme took place in mid-November, as British and French forces launched one last series of attacks before winter made further offensive operations impossible. These attacks achieved modest success, a few hundred yards gained here, a village captured there, but at the usual terrible cost. On November 18, 1916, General Haig officially called a halt to the offensive. The Battle of the Somme, which had begun nearly 5 months earlier with such high hopes and such catastrophic results, was over. What had been achieved? What did those 5 months of fighting, those hundreds of thousands of casualties, actually accomplish? In terms of territory, the results were minimal. The British and French had advanced approximately 6 miles at the deepest point of their penetration. Most of the front had moved only 2 or 3 miles. In some sectors, the gains were measured in hundreds of yards. No strategic breakthrough had been achieved. No German defensive system had been shattered. The front line in November looked much as it had in June, just a few miles to the east. For this modest territorial gain, the price had been staggering. British casualties, approximately 420,000. Over 120,000 dead. French casualties, approximately 200,000. Over 50,000 dead. German casualties, approximately 465,000. Over 160,000 dead. Combined, over 1 million casualties. Over 300,000 dead. The historical verdict on the Battle of the Somme has been harsh. It has become the archetypal example of military futility, of generals ordering men to their deaths in pointless attacks, of the disconnect between the staff officers in their comfortable headquarters and the soldiers dying in the mud. The phrase, "lions led by donkeys," brave soldiers commanded by incompetent officers, became forever associated with the Somme. General Haig, in particular, has been condemned by historians and popular memory as a butcher, a man who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives in pursuit of a strategy that could never succeed. And there is truth in this criticism. The plan for July 1st was fatally flawed. The tactics were suicidal. The casualties were horrific and, in many cases, avoidable. Better intelligence, more flexible tactics, more realistic expectations might have saved tens of thousands of lives. But there is another perspective, one that the soldiers of 1916 could not see, but which becomes clearer with historical distance. The Battle of the Somme did achieve its primary strategic objective. It relieved pressure on Verdun. German forces that would have been committed to the offensive at Verdun were instead sent to defend the Somme. The German attacks at Verdun slackened and eventually stopped. France, which had been on the brink of collapse in May and June, survived. Moreover, the Somme contributed to the gradual weakening of the German army. Germany could not afford to lose 500,000 casualties any more than Britain could. The German army that emerged from the Somme was diminished, exhausted, forced onto the strategic defensive. In 1917, Germany would withdraw to the Hindenburg Line, giving up hard-won territory to shorten their lines and conserve manpower, a tacit admission that they could no longer hold everything they had taken. But these strategic considerations offered little comfort to the soldiers who fought at the Somme, or to the families who received telegrams informing them of sons and husbands who would never return. For them, the Somme was not a strategic success. It was a tragedy, personal, immediate, and irreparable. The Somme shattered the optimism with which Britain had entered the war. It destroyed the illusion that patriotism and courage were sufficient to win. It created a generation that would be forever marked by trauma, by survivors' guilt, by the knowledge of what industrial warfare could do to human bodies and human souls. After the Somme, British war literature turned dark. The poets who had celebrated adventure and glory in 1914 now wrote of mud, rats, gas, and meaningless death. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, the voices of disillusionment, of anger at the waste, of determination to bear witness to what had been endured. Today, the Somme is quiet. The battlefields have been reclaimed by agriculture. Farmers still occasionally uncover unexploded shells, rusted rifles, and fragments of human bone. Vast military cemeteries, Thiepval, Delville Wood, Pozières, contain the graves of tens of thousands of soldiers, many marked only as known unto God, because their identities were lost. The Thiepval Memorial bears the names of over 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died at the Somme and have no known grave. Men who simply disappeared into the mud and shell fire, whose bodies were never found or never identified. Every year on July 1st, at dawn, ceremonies are held at these memorials. The names of the dead are read. Poppies are laid. And for a moment, the world remembers what happened on the Somme in the summer of 1916. The Battle of the Somme. July 1st through November 18th, 1916. 141 days. Over 1 million casualties. 6 miles gained. A strategic success. A tactical failure. And an enduring symbol of the tragedy, the futility, and the terrible cost of the First World War. It failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, but it succeeded in grinding down the German army and relieving the pressure on Verdun. More profoundly, it forged an unbreakable myth of stoic endurance for the British and a bitter legacy of strategic failure and immense, senseless loss. The Somme remains a haunting symbol, a landscape where the echoes of shattered lives still resonate. If you want to understand the true cost and the enduring impact of military history's greatest struggles, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and share your thoughts below. We want to hear from you. What do you believe was the single greatest lesson or failure learned from the Battle of the Somme? Thanks for watching.